Martin Popoff from the Contrarians here. Welcome to the very first episode of a new series we're going to start called Who Invented Heavy Metal? I'm calling this a new series because this is actually the very first episode. Now, this is, just to explain, this is something that Marco and I have talked about for years. I did this book called Who Invented Heavy Metal? And it's one of my favorite books that I've done of mine. It's 120,000 words that ends in 1971. The purview of this series is going to go well beyond that. But what I wanted to do was Marco and I had originally discussed kind of going through it and going through the entire history and all the points, because it's a timeline and quote sort of thing. But what I wanted to do is simplify it out and turn this into a bit of a primer on the albums that invented heavy metal. Now, you always, I've said many times that, there are all these stepping stones, building blocks, songs, first use of fuzz pedal, extreme vocal, feedback, theater, the Greeks, the wall, the horns blowing down the walls of Jericho, all this sort of stuff, marching music, scary music. There's a pile of things smaller than albums that go to invent metal, but you've always heard me say that to me, what's most important is the full album situation. Now, the first one we're going to start with here is not the most important full album. To give it away, obviously the cover kind of gives it away, and I've said this many, many times, of course, as well. That the most important album in the invention of heavy metal is Black Sabbath, but we're not doing that one today, and we're going to do a few episodes that are going to lead up to that because there are some other important full albums. But like I say, this is not going to focus on all the tidbits leading up to it. I mean, for example, I'm gonna quote a couple of things from this book, but leading up to the first thing we're going to talk about here, there's 66 pages, how fitting, of stuff before we even get to the first album in this book. So the first album that I've always said is important as a building block of heavy metal, as a Who Invented Heavy Metal full album. I'm not saying every song on it is heavy, but it's the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Are you experienced? No question mark. Remember that. Kind of annoying, right? So the story behind this is, Jimmy had been around. He'd been a struggling R&B sort of guy, but he signs on with Animals bassist Chas Chandler. He's brought to the UK, not with a band. A band is assembled, basically the first power trio, right? We've got Mitch Mitchell in there and Noel Redding. Decca turns them down, but they sign with fledgling shoestring Who label Track. And they're off to the races. There are some singles, and then there's a full album. So, to mention let's talk about the album first of all. So we get an album. It comes out in the UK May 12th, 1967. I just want to kind of go through this. It comes out in the States in August of 67, and they changed the cover. Jimmy didn't like the cover. He wanted something a little more psychedelic. But to make the argument of why this is here. So I'll talk about the additional singles when I get to the US one, because it's a little confusing of what we get for an album here. But so the UK album comes out, and of course, Jimmy, let's talk about Jimmy first of all. So he is incredibly important in redefining what you can do on electric guitar. And he's very electric. He's very crazy. There's feedback. There's noise. There's aggression. So right out of the gates, his brain is wired a whole different way from your Eric Claptons and your Pete Townsend and anybody else who is sort of around at this time. We're talking 1967. Remember, we've got a few records that are going to lead us up to Black Sabbath. But yeah, this is the earliest. We're talking early 1967, right? So the album opens with Foxy Lady, which is definitely a proto metal, a fledgling metal sort of song. It's got heaviness. It's got a riff. It's got the famous Foxy Lady chord. We've got Manic Depression coming in at track 2. And this also, I've often talked about, and other people have as well, this being a proto-progressive metal song. It is a little bit strange, with its sort of spidery beat to it, but it's got a riff, and it's got a few stacked chordal sort of licks to it as well. So again, you're getting the first idea of heavy metal riffing. Remember, I've talked about the idea of heavy metal being almost like crowding around an oil drum with garbage in it, burning, in the back streets, warming your hands off of that fire. The idea is with heavy metal is that everybody in the band is warming their hands around the fire of a guitar riff, right? So that's why we've got Kinks All Day, All the Night and Kinks You Really Got Me as precursors in this sort of idea, right? It's all about the riff, right? Then we get Red House, which is a slow blues. Then we get Can You See Me, which is a heavy kind of proto Blue Cheer, proto MC5 kind of thing, right? So you basically see the roots of some of the other albums we're going to talk about in this Who Invented Heavy Metal series. Lover Confusion is next. Lover Confusion is basically a driving beat. There's some feedback there. It's not a blues, so that's an important part also of my definition of what heavy metal is. So you don't get a blues. And, there's licks in there. There's kind of a little doomy sequence happening as well. Then you've got I Don't Live Today, which I think is, rivals a song we're going to talk about on the US edition, rivals that song as the most proto heavy metal or heavy metal per se, heavy metal recorded in a 1967 way, heavy metal song, right? It's got this kind of weird hiccup beat. It's got a heavy lick to it kind of thing. Then we've got May This Be Love, which is kind of like a psych ballad, not heavy. It's almost a bit raga, right? So he's picking up on the Beatles a little bit here, especially the drums are a little bit raga on this. And then we've got Fire, which is driving enough, heavy. There's spaces in it, not particularly heavy recorded guitar. I don't think Jimmy really arrives. I think some of our later albums will be a little more insistent on adding the amount of fuzz. Although, a song we're going to talk about from Jimmy definitely has that coming up. Third Stone from the Sun is the third track on side 2 of the UK edition, and that is basically a psych song. And then Remember is kind of like a funky rock mid-temperature sort of song. The last song on the album is the title track, Are You Experienced, which is psych, but there's kind of some roiling guitar. It's noisy enough. There's some scraping of the strings going on there. Okay, and then what happens is there is a North American edition in August of '67, and what they do there is they do some swaps and adding on the singles that came out along the way. So it opens with Purple Haze, which is probably heavier than I Don't Live Today. Some real heavy metalness going on there with that whole opening sequence. There's some fiery kind of licks going on there. So that was a single in the UK, and now it's coming out on the US edition. Manic Depression we talked about. They put Hey Joe on there, which is a cover, of course, and it's a ballad, but it was a single in the UK, so it's not on the UK. Lover Confusion, May This Be Love, I Don't Live Today, again, a heavy one there. Then we get side 2 opens with The Wind Cries Mary, which is another single, and it's a ballad, R&B, psyche kind of thing. Then we get Fire, like I say, which was pretty heavy. Third Stone from the Sun, Foxy Lady with the US spelling with the E in there, but again, fairly heavy. And Are You Experienced, noisy enough kind of thing, right? Also, non-LP tracks from, and a significant one is from around this era is Stone Free, but you've got Cowbell and a bit of a riff there, so it's heavyish as well. So this really is the most impressive full album that talks about a new kind of music, and of course, overshadowing the fact that this is a new kind of music is that this is a new kind of guitarist. That's kind of the most important thing here. It was an absolute hit. This to me speaks of that idea I've talked about so many times about how people like heavy metal, they just don't know it. So when this comes out, spent 33 weeks on the British charts, peaking at number 2. August 23rd, Reprise Records is how it comes out in the States, reaches number 5, remains on the charts for 106 weeks. 76 of those in the top 40. So people are loving this new extreme music, right? And this is the start of the summer of love and psych in a big way. And it's a very psychedelic album, but it is definitely a hard hitting psychedelic album, right? So I wanted to mention just a few things, to put some finer points on the timeline here. Looking at my book here, so like I say, it's 66. So we've got January 11th, 66 pages. Sorry, January 11th, 67. Signs to Track Records. And I thought this was an interesting quote that I got from Bill here. In Hendrix, Mitch Mitchell was playing jazz as well as hard rock. He played everything. But wherever Jimmy went, Mitch went. And Noel Redding, he played that kind of free bass thing, which we hear so often in hardcore music. But of course, I know that Entwistle was, to me, the ultimate bass player. And the only exception for me would be Jack Bruce. These were great bass players. And so when Geisler showed up, he started playing rhythm guitar. But then he changed to bass. And when he played bass, he was just all over the place. So what Bill's going into here is this idea of everybody, and he says right at the end here, everybody is playing a lead instrument. So there's an element of this new wild form of heavy metal or heavy music, heavy music, and also psych begats heavy metal, and psych also begats prog. And this everybody playing a lead instrument idea, you can loosely apply to early heavy metal. You can apply to another power trio, like someone like Led Zeppelin. You can apply it to The Who, which is kind of a power trio. Like I say, you can apply it to prog, but here, and Sabbath, of course. Bill's alluding to his own band. And then also, of course, he's alluding to Jimi Hendrix himself. Got a long quote from Doug Wimbish here. I thought there was a good one here, though. Okay, Jimmy plays the Bag of Nails in London, January 27th, 67. Pete Townsend and Eric Clapton are in attendance, as is electronic specialist Roger Mayer, who meets Jimmy for the first time and starts talking gear with him. So, yeah, gear is important. The advancement of PAs is important to the invention of heavy metal as well. Jimmy decides to record the guitar solo using Mayer's new gizmo. Let's see. February 3rd, 67, Purple Haze is completed with new guitar solo prompted by Jimmy's meeting with Roger Mayer. Let's see. We've got some entries about Rosemary's Baby and Velvet Underground. But then we go on to March 17th, 67. Purple Haze is issued as a single. Delane Lee and Olympic then I go back and mention, I've said this before, but the first heavy metal song, Johnny Burnett Trio, Train Kept Rolling. So there's a little comparison there with that. Let's see. March 31st, 67, Jimmy sets fire to his guitar for the first time at the Astoria. How more heavy metal is that? First U.S. single, Hey Joe, 51st anniversary, May 1st, 67. So they're getting singles in the States well before the album comes out. May 5th, 67, Wind Cries Mary, Highway Child, UK single, May 12th. Debut album in the UK, like I say. I thought this was really cool. So I interviewed Jimmy's roadie, Neville Chesters. And he says, it's really difficult to describe Jimmy. I don't think many people really knew him, even though we were a 5-piece unit on the road. Everything was so cheap that I used to bunk with Noel and Jerry used to bunk with Mitch. And Jimmy also, Jimmy always had his own room, but it's difficult. It was kind of magical the way he touched the guitar and it made noises. And you thought, how the hell did that happen? It was unique, and it really is still today. I mean, there are so many people who compare Jimmy or try to be compared to Jimmy, like Stevie Ray Vaughan. So yeah, so the idea of making the guitar make all these new noises is a very heavy metal thing. Then Neville says, of course, he was never called heavy metal. He was loud, and he could be very loud, but there's a difference, really. I've seen some of the best musicians in the world comment on Jimmy, and you begin to see where he fits in. When he played with Little Richard, he would get pissed off with Jimmy very early on, excuse me, like upstaging him, and that was just Jimmy. And then the early comments of Little Richard are, Jimmy, well, he was too loud, he was too this, he wasn't playing what I wanted. And then he gets nicer and nicer until he's saying, well, Jimmy was unique, he really was. But Jimmy would sit in a room. I think the term sleeping with the guitar is not just given to Jimmy, it's quite a few musicians, but he did. He had a guitar with him the whole time, and he would sit and do things, but they never really rehearsed, and Jimmy never did what you would call practice. So next I've got Ted Nugent putting him in context. Stooges guitarist James Williamson, who says, Jimmy was enormous and he has to be noted. I'm not even sure what heavy metal means, but Jimmy certainly raised the bar on what a guitar player could be and what it means. If you're going to call somebody the best guitar player, I think it's him. All these guys like Eric Clapton and so forth, he was a fine guitar player, but they completely got smoked when Jimmy came around. Jimmy was a really, really talented guy that had his own thing. We've got some Sgt. Pepper mention here. We've got June, we get Purple Haze coming out with The Wind Cries Mary's the B-side. And then on. Actress James Manfield, Yardbirds, blah, blah, blah. Is that a lot of Yardbirds? We're not going to be featuring any Yardbirds albums in this series. Detroit. So here we've got the the U.S. issue in August '67, and I've got a cool little picture of an ad there for that on that one. Let's see if we got any Jimmy on the previous pages here. Pictures. Oh yeah, some matches. Pretty cool little stuff there. So there you go. That is our first episode, our inaugural episode of Who Invented Heavy Metal, where we are going to feature albums. So yes, I think this is the first album. Let's call Black Sabbath the first heavy metal album. I'm going to stick with that idea. I've always had that sort of thought. But let's call this the first proto heavy metal album. What do you think of that? Jimi Hendrix Experience, RU Experience. Please let us know in the comments below what you think of this show and that album, and my framing of this album as the first proto heavy metal album. Join our Patreon. That gets you onto our panels and stuff. Subscribe. We got merch, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, like I say, hit like. I keep forgetting to do that even on our own videos. But there you go. Who Invented Heavy Metal? The Jimi Hendrix Experience. Are You Experienced is the first important album in this long story of this glorious music we call heavy metal.